right, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be covering really sort of two big ideas or two key concepts. And so throughout this podcast, you're going to see on the screen a few different prompts of key ideas to take away. And so we're going to be flying through, we're going to sort of connect the dots between the different absolute monarchs. So I'll sort of cover Peter the Great a bit as my model for some of the key ideas that all of our absolute monarchs have exemplified. And then from there, we're going to go into how the different nation states, how the different monarchies interacted into this sort of global war that emerges as a result of the Peace of Westphalia. So that Peace of Westphalia sort of leads to new phases of this balance of power. And so we're going to be tracing some of those wars. Most of what we're covering today is information that your resumes did cover in class. But the difference of this podcast is then we're making the connections between the different resumes. So I'm going to move fairly quickly. I'm going to sort of refer to things and assume that you will use the resumes to find more information or use your textbooks. Okay. So the first key idea of this podcast is the idea that we have different models of political sovereignty which affected the relationship among states and between states and individuals. So different models of political sovereignty that were occurring at this point in Europe. And our model, we can compare it to the British parliamentary system or the Dutch Republic, and compare it to the absolute model, which we have in Russia, France, Austria, Prussia, Denmark, Sweden, all of the places. So Peter the Great is the individual I want to focus on just for right now. Peter the Great, this is a sort of a continuation of some of the notes that we were talking about with the history of Russia. Peter the Great will rule Russia as Tsar from 1682 to 1725. He is the first Tsar after that time of troubles. That's really a very strong Tsar. We did have Michael Romanov, but Peter the Great is another Romanov who's really going to centralize the rule and make incredible changes to the Russian landscape. To this day, the legacy of Peter the Great is really greatly felt. He was a great man in many ways. He was 6 foot and 7 inches. But the part I want to discuss most with you is his westernization policy. So, Peter the Great, developed a system of westernization through many different forms. So through military, administrative reforms, religion, economics, education, and social classes. So I'm going to briefly go through every bullet here. So in terms of westernization for the military, in 1699 he sets up a standing army, and he expands the navy. The Northern War was a war against Sweden in order to have access to the Baltic coast. He wants to have water access to the Baltic coast. So he goes to war against Sweden, and at first he is completely defeated by Swedish troops, but then he is able to gain and defeat Sweden and gain new land thanks to his newly built navy. He also insists on lifetime service of the military. He also builds schools for the military to ensure some form of uniformity, and this is in contrast to the Streltsy and the Streltsy and the earlier military form. The Streltsy were those shooters that ended up sort of becoming their own hereditary force. In terms of administrative reforms, the table of ranks was that term we discussed in class where it was a ranking system based on government service rather than your family history. So all privileges that Peter the Great were going to give you were based on your merit, based on ability and position in your rank. And so he's creating a new noble class, pretty much, really undermining the boyar state. So if we could look back here, right, absolute monarchies limited the nobility's participation in government, but preserved the aristocracy's social position and legal privileges. No better example of this is than Peter the Great, who is going to create a new privileged class that is open to the nobles, but also open to non-nobles. So there is this opportunity for social mobility. After the 8th rank, so in the table of ranks, once you make it to rank 8, the position becomes hereditary, and so it does create this noble group. It is a huge blow to power to the boyars. St. Petersburg becomes his new capital city, and he models it after the West. It is his window onto the West. A beautiful city built right on the water, to be his gateway, where his navy can be proudly connected, and where he can have direct access. He also insists upon all of his high nobility and any government to be centered there. So it becomes sort of his own version of Versailles, and he has a palace built there, very much like a Versailles, all trying to be modeled after the West. In terms of government as well, he's going to build a Senate, which is replacing the Boyar Duma. But this Senate is only 9 to 10 members who are chosen by Peter the Great. So ultimately, the Senate's a far sense of Senate as we know it. Instead, it's a way of him increasing his absolute power. He'll also construct colleges, which are pretty much your committees and administrative bureaus, which help him organize his government. So he'll have a College of Commerce, a College of Foreign Affairs, a College of Justice, College of the Navy. So each one of these was a form of specialization, so that way he can oversee many different departments, and each of those departments can then have a hand in the ruling and administration of the government. In terms of organizing the entire Russian Empire, I mean, you have to remember Russia is enormous, very huge, and he develops a province system, which is modeled after the Swedish setup, where there are going to be, he'll give the larger areas more political importance, and they'll receive more autonomy. In terms of foreigners, he's going to bring more foreigners in. He's going to welcome foreigners in order to have them be experts. He'll set up, it's all based upon merit. In terms of the church, he's going to control he's going to be eliminating the patriarch, and instead setting up the Holy Synod, which is going to be a group of religious leaders that he appoints, and the state will pay their salaries as well as receive the taxes coming from the church. This is going to lead to a response called the Old Believers. The Old Believers will not recognize the reforms that Peter the Great are insisting upon the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so this group will exist and sort of undermine and be an undercurrent straight through Tsar Nicholas. It's actually, some say that Rasputin is considered to be one of the Old Believers, so he kept some of the older traditions of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Peter is viewed as godlike, and through the religion, he's ensuring that power is going to be guaranteed. So in terms of economics, he is going to set up a few different types of taxes, including things like the beer tax, and he will ensure a mercantile system to increase the wealth of his monarchy, as his position. The potato is going to provide stability of food stability for the very poor, and lead to more stable population within Russia. His navy will also include having a merchant fleet that will be able to expand trade, and he'll be going to war at various times against the Ottoman Empire in order to have access to the warm water ports and use the Bosphorus Straits and be able to travel through Istanbul. At times he's successful, other times he fails, but that is part of his trade interest. And he also set up monopolies with various groups taking on those pulls. And in terms of education, he sets up schools for professionals, Western-style schools where they can learn the Western text and translate the Western books into Russian. And for social classes, the concept of real proper etiquette according to the West. So all the etiquette of the Russian way is going to be ignored, and instead he's insisting upon the Western tradition. And so everything is grounded within the West for Peter the Great. After Peter the Great's death, Peter the Third will come into power. Peter the Third is considered sort of weak and inadequate. I'm sorry, there's actually a Catherine there first, but his And then after Catherine, we have Peter III. Peter III marries, though, Catherine of one of the Germanic states, who will become Catherine the Great. And Catherine the Great continues Peter the Great's Western reforms. So we'll talk more about her when we talk about the Enlightenment, but just to keep in mind, so Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, both continue Westernization, but they Westernize without providing the liberal reforms that you'll also see in Western Europe. So the way that Peter the Great is able to centralize his power is by using nobility, creating a new nobility class, but your peasants are still serfs. They're still bound to the land, and they're still incredibly poor. Probably worse off than they would be anywhere else. This mandated service, this lifetime service, people would be taken to build St. Petersburg, and people of Russia are dispensable. That's how they were treated. They were treated as, easily replaced. So Peter the Great, along with Catherine the Great, do many reforms to make Russia look and feel, and for the wealthy, be very much like the West. But for your lower classes, life doesn't change very much. So at this point, we're going to transition into a different tone, but continuing the same mindset. And in this case, we're going to talk about the wars. So after 1648, which is the Peace of Westphalia, we have many different dynastic and state interests, and then also Europe's expanding colonial empires are going to lead to this new phase of war. And war becomes almost the game of the aristocracy. So throughout the 18th century, European powers frequently fought amongst themselves as well as with the Turks and overseas. The fighting often achieved little, but states recognized the need to participate in hostilities in order to earn a place at the diplomatic meetings held to terminate the wars. In the course of the century, essential changes occurred in the distribution of power and prestige. War became like an arm of diplomacy, and it became the game of military aristocracy. Many aristocrats, this was their career. At this point, you would be a general, a military general. The development of organized military hierarchies, as well as the uniforms themselves, became very grand, and the battlefield maneuvers, they're all reflecting the aristocratic urge to manipulate a controlled world. The centralized state power is what is going to make this possible. So the absolute monarch model is what is able to make these standing armies and these grand military movements possible altogether, right? Because now we have professional armies that will serve long-term standing armies that will serve that one monarch. Professional armies engage in combat, supposedly avoiding civilian populations. So there's also this idea of the noble war, that we fight only on a battlefield. It's not the rough, horrific wars of the 30 Years' War that were right there among the civilians. However, in spite of this idea, the aristocracy can't really fight a war in complete isolation. You'll see effects of this, such as high taxation, pillage, enforced conscription, will touch lives beyond the neat little confines of distant battlefields. But there will be this continuous veneer of gentlemanly sport that will cover the 18th century warfare and sort of keep it distant from the modern total war. And this trend of warfare and this style of warfare will continue straight up until the Napoleonic Wars. And it's really the Wars of Napoleon that shift the battleground and the battlefield, and that provides one shift into more modern warfare, and we'll see future shifts, of course, World War I being a major note. But this time period is really a time of many wars, and to start off, I do want to dwell with Austria for a moment and sort of explain where we left off with the Treaty of Westphalia, and to understand how the different countries are going to make varying alliances in order to achieve their own self-interest and balance of power. So when we left off, the Austrian Empire was the Holy Roman Empire. They were the Habsburgs, the great Habsburgs of Spain and Austria, who are dominating Europe. Well, after the Peace of Westphalia, Austria all of a sudden starts shifting its focus, and they're going to be moving almost out of, so you can see if this is the border of the Holy Roman Empire, they're going to be shifting their focus more and more out of the Holy Roman Empire's control and into some new territory, including Hungary. By 1700, the support system of the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish Habsburgs are no longer there for the Austrians, and they are controlling some hereditary provinces in Upper and Lower Austria. They are controlling the Kingdom of Bohemia and Silesia, as well as the Kingdom of Hungary. And these three separate, distinct areas had their own cultures, their own, at times even languages, religions, and nothing held those three regions together except for that Austrian crown and the Habsburg dynasty. One of the great movements that occurred is the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. So I want to just note this. I find as an interesting map. It shows the greatest extent of the Ottoman Empire. It's very rare to find maps that focus more. Let me restart this. It's the Ottoman Empire is one of those empires that you find more maps about its decline rather than its extension. So just a little note about a little bit of Western imperialism here. But so I know we haven't talked too much about the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire was posing a true threat to the rest of Western Europe. And although it was religiously very different, and we've discussed that, conquering Constantinople, making it Istanbul, really leads to different trade relations. By the time of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire is being treated and interacting with the rest of Europe as if it's another European power. Rulers like Suleiman the Magnificent are going to be exchanging letters with the kings and queens of states all throughout Europe, engaging in trade relations and negotiations. The Ottoman Empire is very much present. And the Ottoman Empire is going to expand its power. And since 1526, the region of Hungary is occupied by the Turks, and they're going to struggle against the Turks. And when in 1683 the Turks take Vienna, and this is at the point where we'll have the Habsburgs try to fight back, and eventually the Habsburgs are able to push into Belgrade, and by the Peace of Belgrade they are able to defeat the Turks, and there's a boundary which is set up until the 1900s. So if you can see here, this boundary here becomes a new delineation of the Ottoman Empire. This defeat of the Ottoman Empire by the Austrian Habsburgs is viewed as really the beginning of its decline of the Ottoman Empire. It's marking the first defeat. It's no longer expanding, instead of it's drawing within. However, just want to point out, this is 1717, and the Ottoman Empire exists straight through 1914, and then really exists until the end of World War I, so 1920, 1923. So in terms of the Austrian Empire itself, one of its challenges, because it is those three different regions, is unity. And despite Habsburg efforts, it was still more of a collection of different territories rather than one nation. The King Archduke Charles VI in 1711, who reigned from 1711 to 1740, developed the Pragmatic Sanction in 1713, where he called for every diet. So each of those provinces had its own diet or meeting space for the nobles, where he said that every diet in the empire and archdukes must regard the Habsburg family as indivisible, and he had other nations agree to it as well, that the Habsburgs should be their rulers. Once again, the only thing holding these regions together was the Habsburg monarchy. The challenge was Charles VI only had one child, Maria Theresa, and he died in 1740. And so war broke out, and it's the War of Austrian Succession, to partition the Austrian Empire among the different nations. And this is going to lead us to the War of Austrian Succession and Diplomatic Revolution. The War of Austrian Succession is one of a series of wars that can be called the Second 100 Years' War. So you'll have this sheet as well. We'll get to it in one moment, but it's a major war that incorporates many different major powers, including England and France. And there's going to be an ongoing pattern throughout this time of England and France using each other and using these other wars to for political purposes. So in terms of steps of the war, the War of Austrian Succession begins when Prussia invades Silesia. So I want to now explain a little bit about Prussia and where they come from again. Once again, we have covered some of these things already, but I just want to explain them again. So Prussia, after the Peace of Westphalia, is going to have two different regions. Before this point, it only was this western portion of the region, and it was Brandenburg, and then Brandenburg and another region, Prussia, joined together and became Brandenburg, Prussia, the Duchy of Prussia. So in 1648, they're also going to then acquire Eastern Pomerania, which then becomes Eastern Prussia. So now we have Western Prussia and Eastern Prussia. In the unity of these two regions is going to be difficult because of Poland, and we're going to dwell a little bit more about Poland in a little bit. I'll talk about Poland separately, but Poland was once a great kingdom of Eastern Europe, and now is in decline, just as the Ottoman Empire will be identified as being in decline. So Prussia is going to be sort of using that weakness as a means of gradually uniting the two parts of Prussia, but that will not occur until 1772. For the rulers of Prussia, their goal was to sort of unify all of these different masses under one Brandenburg house. Now, you may even argue that this doesn't even occur until the unification of Germany in 1871. The Prussian house was ruled by the Hohenzollerns, Hohenzollern, the Hohenzollerns. And this family and their rule, the rulers live very simple lives. They put almost all of their income from taxes into the state funds, and these state funds are very much grounded in the military. The government is made up of large bodies of bureaucrats. The economy is really controlled by companies which are run by the state. Most people in Russia are going to be in some form, in Prussia, are going to be in some form of another working for the state. Now, Prussia itself is open, especially after the bloodshed of the 30 Years' War. It's going to need to repopulate its region, and so it's going to be open to many different religions and races, and it'll be a space of many immigrants. In terms of its class structure, the landed aristocracy will be known as the Junkers, and they are all serving in the military. So everyone has a sense of service to the state. Classes are going to be frozen because land cannot be bought or sold. So whoever owns land will be a hereditary position, and their future children will all be Junkers. The middle class will be submissive. They'll usually just work for the government and lease crown land. The state of Prussia is really distinguished by being a military. The army had an independent life from that of the state. Before 1657, the army was divided amongst regions, but in 1657, they fought a battle where all of Prussia was there, and it then united. Prussia is going to become famous for its militarism, and within those 40 years, Prussia is going to grow from an 8,000 men army to a 30,000 men based army. In order to afford this army, there's new taxes that are introduced, and they'll be growing in power. So back to the War of Austrian Succession, Prussia is going to be going to war at this time, and forgive me, and they'll invade Silesia here. So Frederick the Great, who becomes the absolute monarch that we've been studying of Prussia, and he's known as an enlightened despot because although he is incredibly warlike and ruthless in that way, and an absolute monarch for sure, he does also make many reforms for his country. So like Catherine the Great, we will also go back to him when we discuss the Enlightenment next week. So Prussia is going to invade Silesia, and because they will not recognize Maria Theresa as the future Holy Roman Emperor, and they're hoping to have some of that control. This, as well as many other wars, are going to start to pit region against region. So it's going to be Prussia versus Austria. Austria is going to have the Dutch and Great Britain on their side. For Prussia, Prussia is going to have Bavaria, France, and Spain. And so there's two types of sort of wars going on at the same time here, both colonial and European. By the end, it ends in a truce at the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle. The war only lasted 8 years because there was a worldwide struggle between, but the worldwide struggle between Britain and France are going to continue. Maria Theresa will be recognized as the ruler of Austria, and Prussia will acquire Silesia as a result of this. But the most important thing for the rest of Europe is that we'll have a restoration of the balance of powers. Now, this marks also a diplomatic revolution. Prior to the 7 Years' War, there was a diplomatic revolution, or the reversal of alliances, because of backstabbing that had occurred during the War of Austrian Succession. So England will be making a treaty with Russia, and Frederick of Prussia is going to be making a treaty with Britain as well, because he's concerned of Russia's presence there. The Habsburgs in France are also going to make a new alliance. So these are former enemies from the War of Austrian Succession. They're going to be trading sides. And this is all due to rivalries between Britain and France, and we'll see world wars fought between Europe and the colonies, with Britain supplanting France as the greatest European power. France is going to be just about isolated by everyone except for an alliance with Austria. They're going to end the Bourbon-Habsburg feud, thanks to Maria Theresa trying to merge the two families together. And one consequence of this is that Maria Theresa will marry off one of her daughters to France. So although probably one of the greatest feuds of European history to this point has been Habsburgs versus Bourbons, or Habsburgs versus France, we're at a point now where it's in both countries' interests to stop that fighting and stop the feud. So Maria Theresa will have one of her daughters, Marie Antoinette, marry the future king of France, Louis XVI. This alliance was never popular, both among the Austrians as well as the French. And then Russia is going to actually switch sides and join the Franco-Austrian alliance because Tsarina Elizabeth hated Frederick the Great of Prussia. This is all building into the 7 Years' War. So I want to just for one moment point out to you, I'm sorry, I jumped a little too far ahead there, the sheet that you have before you, the Second 100 Years' War. So here we see the time period from 1680 until the end of the Napoleonic Wars, so really 1815. And if you trace the time here, we have wars that are both occurring in Europe as well as having a colonial name, because each of these wars involves both European powers as well as the colonies. And the one consistent belligerent set of one group versus another will be France versus Britain. And that's why it's a neat way to remember this time frame as being the Second 100 Years' War. The conflict between Britain and France is continuing time and time again, but with various allies in various situations and various placements. But throughout, for a little over 100 years, it's going to be a constant battle back and forth between those two regions. So the 7 Years' War actually begins in America and Europe, and was another war of partition, or dividing up the different reigns. So this is also known as the French and Indian War. Austria will fight against Prussia because Austria wants Silesia back, and Prussia will be supported by Sweden and some German states and Great Britain. The Prussian Junkers and serfs will rally behind their leader, but ultimately they're not quite weak. They are fairly weak. Russia is going to originally be on the side of Austria and France, but then will later swap sides to Prussia and Great Britain. And then Peter III will switch sides again because he likes Peter the Great. So Russia at this point is just playing diplomatic ties. At the end, 1763, Prussia will retain Silesia and ultimately lose nothing. However, right before Prussia's victory, we'll have Catherine II, Catherine the Great of Russia, become Tsarina of Russia, and she'll withdraw her forces, and therefore Russia will also gain nothing from this territory. There will continually be a colonial war, and the greatest result of all of these things is that Great Britain is going to be getting the most out of all this, and France by this point will be greatly weakened. So the result of all these diplomatic wars makes England the greater power of all of Europe. So at this point, I want to just transition into the weakness of the Polish monarchy. And then the partition of Poland. So a little background about Poland. Sorry, I know we're covering a lot of material today. Poland was, the king was elected for much of its history. It was a elected position, and the nobility therefore had a lot of power. The nobility had something, there was a central diet that had something called the liberum veto, or a free veto. And that meant that if any one person had any issue whatsoever with a bill, an act, a law that was about to be passed, they could veto it, and then it would not be able to be passed, just by one vote. It was the free veto, liberum veto. And this meant that the king really would struggle to get anything done. Originally, the king was able to really strengthen Poland by unifying many different regions under this one crown. The problem was he still gave the power to the nobility. It was never able to manage the nobles' power, and it was very ineffective. And so ultimately, it was pretty much nobles ruling their local area. Due to this weakness, Poland is ultimately going to be partitioned. After there was a war over Polish succession, foreign influence really made it impossible for the Polish government to really do anything. So the partition of Poland sort of occurs in three different parts. So once again, just to remind you a little bit about the goal of Prussia, Prussia wants to unite East and West, and so you'll see that in between area is an area that they want to gain from Poland, that yellow area. So gradually the partition of Poland occurs in three different moments. The first partition occurs in 1772, where Russia is going to take a little northern slice. Austria is going to take a southern slice, and Prussia will take Pomerania, ultimately being able to create the Great Prussia and have claim all along the Baltic Sea. During this first partition, there is quite a bit of resistance. Poles are going to try to renew their nationalism, but it's really only coming from the nobles. They try and form a diet to be able to make a new constitution, make the kingship hereditary, but it's not going to be very successful. The second partition occurs in 1793, and this also is led by Russia and Prussia. This also is faced by resistance. This is led by Thaddeus Kosciuszko, and he's going to be defeated in 1794. The third partition is when Poland ceases to exist, and this occurs in 1795. Poland is going to be partitioned without any war. The disappearance of Poland was a blow to France, who used to use it as an outpost in the east. Russia is going to gain the rest of Ukraine at this point, really expand its power, as well as Lithuania. And Austria is going to set up like a little Poland in Krakow. They're going to control Krakow there. So ultimately, the international balance of power is going to remain unchanged until 1789. Your most victorious states included Britain, Prussia, and Russia. France, Spain, Austria, Turkey all survive but suffer serious blows. Most historians say that the balance of power really resided in efficiency in commerce and not really warfare. If you look at those countries that succeeded, they're countries that are succeeding because of expansion of wealth. I mean, Britain. The reason why Britain's there is for this new commerce, and that's where we will stop for today. So please fill in the worksheet I hope you've been filling in the worksheet as you're going, and have a great afternoon. Take care.